Hey guys, Zane here with another One Take review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Boris album, Heavy Rocks. Heavy Rocks is the latest studio album by Japanese experimental rock/metal band Boris, as well as their third studio album to be called Heavy Rocks. It's annoying and stupid that they don't just call them Heavy Rocks 1, 2, and 3, but that's just what they chose to do creatively. I think it's dumb. But, I guess I have to criticize it beyond that, I suppose. So, hey, the Heavy Rocks series has been pretty great overall anyway. I can't really say anything particularly bad about it. The first two Heavy Rocks entries were utterly fantastic and two of my favorite Boris releases overall, and the third entry is maybe even better than those. For context, the Heavy Rock series has always been Boris's headfirst dive into the realms of hard rock and heavy metal in a slightly more traditional sense, though things have changed up on this record. I will get to that in a moment. And after a very disappointing album earlier this year with the drone-based W, it was about time Boris got back on track in the way that they know how to do best, which is just absolutely vicious, apocalyptic hard rock and heavy metal. Heavy Rocks 22 differs from its two predecessors in that it doesn't quite rely on stoner metal as much as it does noise rock. This is Boris sort of leaning into that realm of their wide catalog of different genres that they have covered over the years, and I'm all for it personally. It's nice to see them not quite rinse and repeat things from the first two Heavy Rocks albums. This also means that Boris are more willing to add touches and just general spices of different sounds and overall tones that are associated with noise rock, and this ranges from industrial to the Japanese hardcore scene. One could definitely argue that these are all sounds that Boris has dabbled with in the past. After all, fan-favorite records like 2005's Pink have been deeply attached to these particular kinds of sounds. However, Heavy Rocks 22 manages to stand out from most of the band's catalog in general, as it comes across as a sort of love letter to classic hard rock and metal, while in and of itself being a refreshingly, fresh take on this particular niche that sounds very modern even for the ever-evolving Boris. Now mind you, there are a number of minor details that help in that self-distinction. The first half of Heavy Rocks 22, despite being more comparable to the prior two Heavy Rocks albums than the second half of the record, definitely makes use of these minor details to make it stand out from the two records that came before it, as well as most Boris albums that came before it. This is perhaps most heavily seen in the usage of the saxophone on tracks in the first half of the album like Blah 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 and the album opening She Is Burning. Although the instrument itself is mostly inconspicuous in nature, guest performer Kazuya Wakabayashi takes note from the book of noise-based rock bands like Flipper by making the saxophone as uncontrollably abrasive as possible, perhaps even more so than the guitar work. This greatly adds to the predetermined chaos that is already the blueprint for many of these songs. Beyond that, Wata's guitar work is always willing to deliver sounds that could occasionally be described as post-metal, while Atsuo and Takashi's drumming and bass work respectively are as strikingly vicious as ever. The second half of Heavy Rocks 22, however, is about as much of a musical 360 as Boris could possibly take without actually dancing out of the realms of hard rock and metal. Up to the point that Nosferatu rolls around, this is a pretty straightforward but nonetheless excellent Boris record, but that aforementioned track takes up drone metal influences that are so brutally heavy that it makes your average stoner rock band like Fu Manchu or Caius look like a 50s doo-wop band in comparison. Soon comes a flurry of 4 more tracks with influences that range from thrash metal to punk to industrial metal to typical experimental rock, just a number of different genres that are not entirely distanced from stoner metal, but about as much as you can without it being a totally different genre overall. The industrial aesthetics that are demonstrated in the track Ghostly Imagination are particularly interesting, and while I wouldn't consider the song a highlight on the album by any means, in fact it's one of the only two weaker tracks here, I will say that it would make for a very interesting full-length effort from Boris, and I do hope they expand on that side of their sound in the future. Now with all of that in mind, cohesion is a major factor towards the success of Heavy Rocks 22, and that doesn't really sound like it makes sense. As enticing and well executed as all of these different sounds and tones are, it would be easy for your average band to fail to make them fit into a larger picture to make a cohesive full-length album that's worth returning to. However, anyone who had doubts over the past dozen or so excellent albums that Boris have released in the past, that they are masters of switching up genres, this will definitely change your mind on that. Despite Heavy Rocks 22's unpredictability, especially during its second half, it manages to flow as a singular listening experience, which, even with it being Boris, a group that have definitely done stuff like this in the past, still comes across as a bit surprising and undeniably impressive. Behind the walls of a variety of different musical operations is a singular, cohesive passion for just manic, apocalyptic performance. Even the album closer Not Last Song, which ends things off on a slightly odd or maybe even at first confusing experimental singer-songwriter note, is commendable and feels somewhat understandable in the context of the record after a number of non-stop metal-based tracks, even if it does end slightly abruptly, perhaps a bit too abruptly. So overall, Heavy Rocks 22 is arguably the best entry in the Heavy Rocks series of Boris albums thus far. Some of Boris's best work in general has been put through the filter of hard rock and heavy metal, and this record is certainly no exception. I'm going to give this album 4.5 stars out of 5. My one take on this record is that with a colorful palette of influences and an undying love for energetic performance, the only issue that arises with Heavy Rocks 22 is the questionable choice from Boris to not just call it Heavy Rocks 3, but again, 4.5 stars out of 5, and with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.